Welcome, people. This is Joshy J. So today I'm going to break down my process of using 3D and 2D to create artwork. I'm going to build a mech head to illustrate this process. I thought it would be appropriate because mechs are built out of a lot of shapes, and their shape language is very strong, and it's really nice using Blender to just build basic shapes. So that's the first point, is when I go into Blender, I'm not going in and, like, I don't know an insane amount about Blender. I'm not like a Blender guru, but I do know enough to be able to build basic shapes. So this is what I'm doing here. This is what you can see it's going on here, is I'm just using very basic modifiers, just putting shapes together. And originally I had a few sketches down and I had an idea of what I wanted. So that's worth doing first, is if you have an idea, put it down on paper, sketch it out, maybe draw it in Photoshop so you know what you're getting into. And essentially, when you're doing this stuff in 3D, when you're building something in 3D, you can use it for multiple purposes. So you can use it for different lighting situations, which is exactly what I'll be doing. So in the end, you're going to see I built a whole lot of different lighting situations, and I could change the lighting because I learned how to do like a cell shader, which made it look very 2D, which is kind of the aim here. So there's this rule that goes, it's the 80-20 rule, where it says you can get 80% of things done with 20% of the tools. And I think that applies very heavily when it comes to technical work, such as using 3D software. It can be very intimidating in the beginning because it is new. And yes, when you start anything, it is really difficult. And yeah, starting something new it's slow in the beginning, and it's monotonous, and it takes some time. But the thing is, if you love it, if you really enjoy it, it's not too much of an effort. So don't get flustered by the interface. Just use the basic shapes to build out very basic forms, and then you can export it. So that's what I did. You'll see later. But essentially, mostly it's just, you'll see the shapes here. I'm just cutting rivets in the shapes. I'm shading them. I'm shading them smooth, and I'm just getting a general outline of what I want this mech head to look like. So you can tell it's a mech. You can tell it's a mech, obviously. And you'll see I was playing around with the modifiers. I don't know too much about the modifiers, but I know enough to make it easy. So the Boolean modifier allows you to cut shapes out of other shapes. And obviously the subdivide modifier is a really good one to understand. And these aren't very hard to understand. They're very basic modifiers. They just save you a lot of time. But so there was a point where when I realized I was done. So this is another one. This is what I'm doing now. You'll see I'm using the metaball. Metaballs are really cool for creating organic shapes. So I wanted to give this guy like a really cool scarf type of deal. And a metaball is cool because when you create, it actually doesn't have topology. So when you create it, and you duplicate it, it just joins to the one next to it. So you get this very organic type looking shape. So you'll see now I started delving in the node editor, and there's some great tutorials online about how to use the nodes, and it is quite complex, but I decided to go with a cell shader type of look and tweaked a few settings, and then I essentially just moved the lighting around to create different lighting scenarios. So like you can see in the sheet that I've got painting here in the background is I've got I've got different lighting scenarios, and some very dramatic, and it's cool because you can paint over it. To be honest, in the end of this, I actually end up changing this head. I did a different mech head altogether. Because this one was far too complex for what the goal that I was trying to achieve. So I ended up scrapping this head. I think it was worth it in the end, to be honest. So if I'm looking back now, a tip I would suggest is go very gray. So you can see I went really dark here with this cell shader, and then I went really light, so super contrasty. which is fine in some areas, but I realized I actually wanted a more gray kind of a look. And when you gray down an image, you have a lot more control over the final outcome of the image. So I just wanted to keep it gray. So you'll see now when I switch to the other mech head that I did, I didn't record it, but I had to use that head because this one was just far too complex. And so that's the head that I used, and I built that in Blender, just very basic shapes, very smooth type of head. And one thing I would suggest is just use see it as using cylinders and circles and spheres and cubes to build whatever it is you want to build with the big shapes. And then you can come in and add small details. So for now, I'm just making it look all nice and oily and very painterly. So kind of towards my style. And that's what's cool about this, is that you've got all the lighting figured out for you. You've got all the perspective figured out for you. And then when you bring it into Photoshop after you've been in Blender, you pretty much just are stylizing, you're just beautifying it, you're prettifying it. So it's a really cool process to use. And so you'll see, I started very broad with broad brush strokes, and then I started adding more different plates and surfaces, and you'll see I added a pipe there, but I don't think I would have done that in Blender. I would never have done all of these details in Blender. So also with regards to the brushes that I used in this particular case, it wasn't very complex brushes. It was just a Blender brush that I actually hardly ever use. I've only started to use that Blender brush ever so recently, but it's highly effective, especially if you see that C1, how it looks like the paint has almost been hit off it, like this guy's been knocked out. He looks really hardcore, by the way. Definitely wouldn't freaking mess with this guy. So I used the Blender brush tool to paint through it and then color pick the color under it and paint back. So it almost gives this jagged type of a look, which is really freaking cool. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot more lighter going in, knowing your perspective has been worked out for you and knowing your lighting has been worked out for you, and then all you need to do is just all you're doing is you're just stylizing it. So I would say get a hold on Blender. This isn't an actual technical tutorial as much as a advice on how I use the different tools. So you'll see it's actually not that technical. The understanding of how light affects different areas in a 2D space is actually really important. So that fundamental knowledge needs to come before you just dive straight into Blender, because you'll find you'll be able to build stuff in Blender, but you still need to have some sort of understanding of how light works and how it interacts with objects. So here in this case, I added a cool gradient map of the grayscale that I painted. That just gave it some more color. I was started in black and white, but I switched over and it was a good change. And then I just added these color dodge, color burn layers to just pump up the saturation on that eye in the front. And I wanted to give them different variations. So you check, I got a yellow one. I quite like the yellow one. I think the yellow one is probably my favorite. So yeah, I just added different rivets, different cuts in this guy's face, different variations. And it's definitely a process worth doing. I think in future tutorials, I'll definitely try to do a more organic shape. So mech is quite geometric, which is great to start with. It's very amazing to start with very geometric shapes. But in future tutorials, I think organic objects will be really fun to play with, like the meta ball. But otherwise, it's just basic brushes, and it saves a lot of time, and it's really, really fun to get into. When you get into Blender, you feel like you literally are world building. Essentially, it is world building. So yeah, otherwise, dudes, I hope you got a lot from this. I would love to hear what you guys found interesting, and if there's any advice on future tutorials you'd like me to do. I would really dig to hear from you guys. Cool. I'll check you guys in the next one. Cheers.